Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's risk reduction, risk management class, where we're going to talk about basically a few forms that will be released in December, the December 22 forms release. And we're going to discuss how those forms are going to be necessary due to the changes coming into real estate. Let me do a little housekeeping here. There are two handouts. One is a part one handout and the other is a part two handout. I don't really think we'll get to part two today. I'll be amazed if I get through part one fast enough that we'll have any time left over for part two. So I will cover part two plus a few more additional forms that aren't even in part two for our next session, which I believe we'll probably schedule it in early December to complete our review of the new forms that are going to be released. So let's talk about the focus of today's class. As we mentioned in the email, I don't know how many of you are aware of this or not, but there are some significant changes coming soon, and some of them are upon us already, regarding the payment of buyer broker agent commissions. Traditionally, buyer broker or buyer agent commissions were paid through the MLS by the listing agent and was purely a matter between the buyer's agent, the listing agent, and probably the seller. That is changing, and the changes are being driven in large part by the DOJ, but also because NAR is somewhat sympathetic to some of the positions the DOJ, Department of Justice, is taking regarding agents collecting commissions for representing buyers. Here's the central concept, and I think most of you would probably agree. Even though it might not be structured this way, in fact, buyers pay buyer's agent commissions. It is a cost borne by buyers by virtue of the fact that sellers build it into the price. And so because buyers are paying it, DOJ reasons, they should have some ability to exercise who pays it and how it's paid. So the actual amount that a buyer and a buyer's agent agree to that the buyer's agent be compensated is a matter between the buyer and the buyer's agent. But the commission that the buyer's agent is paid by a listing agent or by a seller is subject to negotiation between the buyer and the seller. That's what's going to happen moving forward. I hope I didn't confuse you in the way I said that. There are some changes that are upon us already, and there'll be a few more changes probably at the beginning of the first of the year, and even possibly more as the DOJ and the Association of Realtors come to an agreement. The DOJ filed a class action lawsuit. They filed a settlement. That settlement was negotiated, and in the 11th hour, the DOJ pulled that settlement. And so the DOJ is still researching what they want us realtors to agree to. But in the meantime, CAR is recognizing what is inevitable. So there are some changes, and some of the new forms we're going to talk about reflect those changes. So, for example, effective immediately, you cannot tell a buyer that your services are free if you're receiving compensation from anybody. So it is not free, it's being paid by somebody. And so we sometimes in the past, we used to tell buyers, I can work with you, and here's the good news, it's free to you, you don't pay it. Well, it's not free to them in most cases. So effective now, we cannot advertise to our buyer clients that our services are free. We also must disclose to the buyer the compensation we are receiving, because that does in fact affect the sale price of the home. We're entitled to the compensation that's been agreed to either by the listing agent through the MLS or by the buyer by virtue of a buyer broker agreement. But that number must be disclosed. Obviously, if the buyer broker agreement has a commission amount, the buyer is aware of it. In the past, the MLS hid the compensation to a buyer broker, the CBB or the BA commission, or COM, I guess they call it, in CRMLS. Those fields were hidden in information that was disseminated to the general public. That must change. It's changing now. I think after the first of the year, if it hasn't already changed, it's going to change. So buyers will be able to see the commission the seller's offering us. Who pays and how it's paid, it will now be negotiable between the seller and the buyer. So a buyer can now negotiate for the seller to pay any obligation the buyer has, and how much the seller pays. The buyer can't negotiate a commission away that the buyer has agreed to pay. But a buyer can, in the future, negotiate how much the seller pays to the buyer's agent, and that's going to be profound. So, what does that mean? What going forward? What are we faced with as a result? Buyer broker agreements, buyer representation agreements are going to become far more prevalent, just like listing agreements came about, nearly 100 years ago to protect listing agents when they went to work for a seller to make sure they got paid. Buyer representation agreements are going to now be necessary to protect your commission and the fact of how you get paid, because in the future, a buyer can negotiate with a seller that the commission that the seller pays to the buyer can be reduced. Buyers' agents will be forced to sell their value to buyers, because now the buyer is going to see how much you're being paid and how that impacts the sale price of the home. So all of us can only imagine it won't take long before buyers are going to believe should get $500 when in fact we probably are owed, $15,000 for the amount of work we put in for a transaction. So we're going to have to be able to learn how to demonstrate our value to buyers. That's going to become very, very important. Sort of think about, it's going to be very similar, I would say even more profound, but we've already been through this once, and that's when the MLS became disseminated to the general public. Many agents, when I first got into real estate, I would say a significant number of agents didn't bother selling their value. Why? Because we had the MLS. And it was a private database. And if you wanted access to the MLS, you had to work with an agent, period. Well, now that's not true. We now know that buyers have, hundreds of websites they can go to. Sellers can put their homes on websites without even putting them in MLSs. By the way, sellers are allowed to put their property in an MLS without an agent involved. There's been lawsuits filed years ago. One of the key lawsuits was actually filed in San Diego, where we did not allow a private party to enter their property in MLS, and that private party sued and won. And so San Diego MLS, used to be Sandicor, they were one of the first MLSs to allow a FSBO to put their property in the MLS. Well, that's now somewhat universal, and so that affected how we did real estate significantly. I would say these changes to buyer broker compensation, how and who pays it, is going to have that same effect. So with that in mind, that's the background on why CAR is put together these forms. And so take a look, if you will, at part one. We're going to go through the forms. Let me open up my PowerPoint and let's get started going through that. Whoa, I got in the middle here. I got to go to the beginning. Okay. Slideshow, current slide. Okay. All right. So any questions, and you're going to have some questions about these forms. They're going to be released in late December, just after the middle of the month. And there are probably going to be a few more tweaks to them. I have draft copies that I've put in this booklet. So obviously don't use these forms. Wait until they are actually part of what's in zip forms, in CAR forms, and then you'll start using them. And so once you start using them, or if you review this material and you have questions, this is a pretty confusing set of forms, quite frankly. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. And of course, always, anytime you have a question, reach out to me. You can call me on the phone, you can email me, and weekends and evenings, you can call or text my cell. So
don't forget to share your screen, Walt.
Oh, I'm sorry. How do I go back and do that now? Help me out. I don't know. I don't even see where I have a ability to share a screen. Obviously, I do.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, we got it. All right. Can everybody see my screen now?
We can see it, Walt.
Good, good, good. All right. Sorry for that little glitch. New and revised forms, part one, where we're going to be talking about the new buyer representation agreement and a handful of forms associated with the new buyer representation agreement. All right. So the first significant change regarding buyer representation agreements is contained in the RPA, and it's on, I believe, page 2 of the RPA, paragraph 3G3. So in paragraph 3G3, if there's a buyer representation agreement, in other words, if a buyer is obligated to pay a commission to a buyer's agent, if this box is checked, the seller agrees to pay that obligation on behalf of the buyer. So, and that payment is as detailed in the seller's payment of buyer's broker form, which we're going to take a look at next. So, the buyer's broker's commission that the buyer pays can be paid by the seller, and the seller can agree to paying that if this box is checked. Also, in the buyer broker agreement, it says that if any other party pays the buyer, the payment that pays the buyer's agent, if any other party pays the buyer's agent, that payment to the buyer's agent is credited against what the buyer owes the buyer's agent. I got to be very careful when I say these words. So in other words, there's no double commission. You don't get to collect commission from your buyer and from the seller by virtue of the fact it's in the MLS. Because anything you receive by virtue of it being in the MLS, and the seller's agent is compensating you per the terms of the MLS, that would get credited against the commission the buyer owes the buyer's agent. And you're going to see how that works as we go through this. In fact, we're going to see it coming up. So the first form we want to look at is that seller payment of buyer's broker form, the SPBB. This is a new form. It's a fairly simple form. Once you get used to it, first time I looked at it, maybe it wasn't so simple, but when I went through it more than a few times, it got easier and easier to understand. So on the top of the form, of course, you identify the property, the buyer and the seller, and there's a notice that civil code requires on any agreement to pay a commission. This notice must be included. So, of course, Carr included that notice in the red box there. All right, now let's talk about the different ways that the obligation that the buyer has to the buyer's agent can be satisfied. So the first thing is paragraph 1 states that there is an obligation for the buyer to pay the buyer's broker, and that the amount of that obligation is either a percent of sale price or a dollar amount. Usually it's a percentage of sale price, but if it's a dollar amount, you would check it. So this comes from the buyer representation agreement that we will look at in a couple of minutes. And that's called the BRBC. That's going to come from the BRBC. The buyer has entered into a written agreement. We used to call them they're buyer representation agreements. We used to have 3 of them. We're going to only have 1 going forward. 2 of the 3 in the old ones called for compensation. The 3rd one did not. So there's a written agreement. Buyer has agreed to pay the buyer's broker, and that's detailed in paragraph 1. Very straightforward. Okay. Number 2, that the seller's agent has agreed to pay the buyer's broker by virtue of having the property in the MLS. As I've said to many of you, there's actually 2 commission agreements that affect a buyer. Now there's going to be 3, but that affected the buyer agent collecting a commission. The first thing is the listing agent had to have some sort of agreement with the seller. And then the listing agent, by virtue of their membership in the MLS and your membership in the MLS, there's an agreement between you that the seller will pay you whatever is listed in the MLS if you bring a buyer to that property and that property closes escrow. So paragraph 2 basically says that the seller's agent has agreed to pay the buyer's broker per the MLS, and that'll usually be a percentage. So, and it's usually included in the MLS. So sometimes it's a private single party showing where, the seller's agent hasn't put it in the MLS yet, but has arranged for the seller to pay both the seller's agent and a buyer who is bringing an offer directly to the listing agent without having gone through the MLS. So that's why you could check this box here. Because it might not be in the MLS. Usually it's in the MLS, pretty straightforward. And then you would list the amount that the listing agent had agreed to pay the buyer's broker. Now, paragraph 3 is how the calculation of how much the seller shall pay on behalf of the buyer's for the buyer's broker. So the way that works is paragraph 3, little confusing first time you go through it. So I'm going to see if I can explain it kind of simply. So the seller shall pay the buyer's broker as follows. The buyer's obligation for paragraph 1, which is on the buyer representation agreement, minus the amount the listing agent has agreed to pay the MLS, pay the buyer's agent rather, per the MLS. So if the MLS amount satisfied the entire buyer broker agreement amount, in other words, let's say the buyer broker agreement said you're going to get 3%. That's in the buyer broker agreement, the buyer representation agreement that we're going to look at in a minute. The MLS says you're going to get 2%. Then the seller would pay 1%. Why? Because you subtract the 2%, which is paragraph 2, from the 3%, which is paragraph 1, regarding now the seller's obligation is to pay just 1%. Now, if the buyer broker agreement said 2.5% and the MLS said 2.5%, there you can see the seller's not paying anything. So So as a listing agent, you want to be certain that your seller doesn't inadvertently end up paying more than what you thought that the buyer's agent would accept. Because if the buyer broker agreement called for a higher commission than what the seller agreed in the listing contract and what was put in the MLS, the seller, pursuant to the RPA, the new change in the RPA, that paragraph 3G3, the seller would pay the difference. So that's a pretty important thing to keep in mind. Now, it's possible that as a part of the negotiations, the buyer's agent would agree to reduce his commission from the buyer by the like amount so that it would, so that what the seller's paying through the MLS would satisfy the entire obligation. So you can see something that's fairly straightforward can get a little more complicated now that buyers and sellers are now negotiating how a buyer broker is paid by the buyer. Make everybody with me so far? If you have questions, raise your hand. Lindsay, help me out. If you see somebody with their hand up or something in chat, they're completely confused, it might be a good idea to stop now and kind of answer a couple of questions if it's relative to exactly what we're talking about. Okay.
There are a couple questions, Walt.
Yeah.
Well, this is Sharon Miller. How is the buyer paying their 2%? Cash out of pocket, bringing it into escrow?
Well, if the
In
seller's
your example here.
well, the buyer wouldn't pay. If the buyer had if in my example, the buyer broker was, the buyer agreed to pay the buyer's broker 3%. The seller in the MLS said they'd pay 2%. So you
Okay,
subtract
so the
2%.
seller's paying 2% of the 3%?
No, 2% of the sale price.
But okay, 2% of the sales price.
Right.
If they're paying 2%, where's
Right.
the buyer coming up with their other 1%?
1% is one of the closing costs the buyer has to bring to escrow.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, because I think when you went through it, you had what buyer and seller were doing reversed, or at least that was how I heard it. Thanks.
Okay, right.
Walt, Vicky wants to know regarding item number 3, what if there's no buyer compensation agreement?
Well, if you have no buyer compensation agreement, then you're only going to get what the seller agreed to pay. In other words, you say buyer compensation agreement, what you mean is, let's not use the word buyer compensation agreement. Buyer compensation is contained within the buyer representation agreement. So the listing contract isn't a listing agent compensation agreement. It's a listing agreement. It's an agreement that includes the compensation that the listing agent will get. So if there's no buyer broker agreement, or if there's a buyer broker agreement and you put $1 in there, well, then, you're going to get, that's going to be completely covered by whatever the seller pays. Did that answer your question, Vicky? Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. All right.
There's a couple more, Walt. Do you want me to answer a couple more?
Yeah, let's take a look at them real
Okay.
quickly.
Dave Zeman's asking, well, he's saying, I thought it was against rules to negotiate commission in a counter offer.
We're not negotiating commission. By the way, that rule is going away. That rule is going to be rewritten because that is a problem in general. But what we're negotiating now isn't the commission. We're negotiating how much the seller pays of the buyer's obligation. This is not reducing what the seller put in the MLS. The seller is obligated, if the seller's agent has a listing contract, the seller's obligated to pay that, and the listing agent's obligated to pay it because the listing agent put it in the MLS. So that's not being reduced. The listing agent, the seller is going to pay whatever's in the MLS. This is not that's a great question, Dave, but it's important to understand the nuance here. We're not negotiating how much compensation the buyer's broker gets. We're negotiating how it's paid. And we're negotiating how it's paid pursuant to an agreement the buyer has to pay a commission to his agent. Now, if the buyer doesn't have a buyer representation agreement, then this form isn't going to even happen, because notice it says that the buyer has entered. Look at number 1. The buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate the buyer's broker. The buyer has. See, that's the BC that we're going to talk about in a moment. If that doesn't exist, well, then this form isn't even used, and you wouldn't check that box because you're not asking the buyer, the seller. Let me go back. You're asking the seller to pay the obligation of the buyer to compensate the buyer's broker. See, so we're not negotiating the amount of commission a buyer broker gets that is listed in the MLS. That makes sense, Dave? Hopefully it does. Okay. Any others, Lindsay, that you could address?
Vicky just wants to know if lenders are going to be okay with this.
Yeah. It's funny. That's a good question, Vicky, because every once in a while, we've done transactions where the buyer pays his own commission. And I've had lenders say, oh, you can't do that. Why? Because it's not normal, whatever normal. My wife taught me years ago the word normal is one of the worst words in the English dictionary. What's normal? It's just your perspective. That's what normal is. So, but I've successfully in every case. I mean, it's not illegal for a buyer to pay a commission. That's it. It's clearly legal. I mean, Carr wouldn't have all these forms if they didn't exist, but Carr wouldn't have a buyer broker agreement. By the way, if you had a buyer broker agreement and you sold a FSBO, there is no MLS. The buyer is going to pay that entire commission. How are they going to pay it? They're going to pay it through escrow. It's going to be a closing cost, and it's perfectly legal. It's a great question, Vicky. We're going to get a little pushback, a little bit, but that'll go away quickly because there's nothing illegal or against any rules or regulations about buyers paying commissions.
Can I say something?
I'm
Go
sorry?
ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I want to say actually the way that is, it's going to help the buyer agent if the seller listing agent, get more paid and then just want to pay the buyer agent less. So that way you can have your buyer to put a higher commission and get probably more commission from the listing agent. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, now, folks, I appreciate it, Azim. I'm going to ask everyone to do me a favor. I do want to answer questions, but we want to stay on what we're talking about because I've got so much to go through here, and I naively believe we would get through this in an hour. I could already see, my gosh, I'm not 1/20th through this, and we're a half hour into the class already. So I appreciate comments, but if you have a question, that's helpful to everybody. If you have a comment, let's save them to the end because that's going to be it's going to take us off track. All right. Now,
can I ask a question real quick?
a question. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's my understanding from what I'm hearing you say is that if we have a buyer's broker agreement with a certain compensation from the buyer, this form needs to be signed and filled out, and the box on the RPA needs to be checked.
Only if you want the seller to pay it.
To pay it, right. So if you do not have a buyer's broker agreement,
then you don't need to check that box.
and then you don't check that box. So how does that satisfy the Department of Justice's criteria that the buyer is informed how much the agent is being paid?
How much the agent's being paid?
Yeah.
There's a form for that coming up.
Oh, of course, another form. Why did I even ask? Okay.
All right. Yeah. All right. Buyer authorizes escrow to provide a portion of the buyer broker agreement to the seller, documenting it. Yes, there is an agreement that the buyer has to pay his agent, because otherwise they would, they could make stuff up. So you can't make, so the seller will get the page one, basically page one. It's the buyer broker agreement's a 3-page form. Okay, now, if the buyer and, I mean, if it's dual agent, if the buyer is represented by the listing agent, then where it can be a little confusing, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here because of time, but how much of the commission is the buyer's agent portion of the commission, especially when the listing agent has an agreement to reduce the commission if he or she represents both sides. So the way that's figured is this form requires that the buyer's agent's portion of the commission is that amount in the MLS. So if you reduce from 6%, let's say it's 6% and 3% to both sides, but if I sell it myself, it's 4%, we're still going to use 3% because that's in the MLS as the seller's obligation to pay the buyer and this buyer's agent, which is in this case the same agent as the listing agent, and the listing agent would get 1% as far as dividing the commission transaction wise, so that we can figure out how much of the buyer's obligation the seller pays. So that benefits, quite frankly, the seller and the buyer, because it creates, especially the seller, it creates a clear understanding of that portion of the commission that's designated as buyer side, and it's defined as the CBB or BA commission in the MLS. Hope that's not too confusing. Okay, and of course, there's a place to sign it. So let's look at the buyer representation agreement. It is going to be some detail early, but then it gets real simple as we get into it. So the first thing I want to tell you again is this replaces the BRE, the BRNE, and the BRNN. It replaces all three of those. We only have now, starting in December, we're only going to have one buyer representation agreement. Okay. Now, when you take a look at the form at the top, of course, the buyer's identified on the top line, the brokerage is identified next. And then the first interesting thing is there's not a date specific of when it expires, but there are a number of days this lasts. So where a listing contract might start on one day and end 6 months later on a specific day, this agreement, if it paralleled the listing agreement, would say 180 days. So it starts on a date specific and ends an X number of days later. All right. Now, the next thing is, of course, the buyer is representing that he doesn't have any other agreements, obligations to pay any other agent, just like a listing contract. That same kind of thing is in a listing contract. The seller is saying, I don't have any other agreement to pay any other agent for listing my house. So that's what paragraph 2 is. Paragraph 3 is where you detail the property that the buyer's agent is going to attempt to help the buyer acquire. Now, the description contained in 3A should be general, but not wide open. So location anywhere in the state of California would fail. Now, if your buyer loves you and you end up collecting and you put down anywhere in the state of California, who cares? But if the buyer and you don't see eye to eye after the end of this whole deal, excuse me, courts have held that too broad a parameter is what's termed a non-conscionable a clause. In other words, it's unfair. Excuse me. So state of California, too much. San Diego County, fine. You get away with San Diego County just fine. Now, if you want to just specify some neighborhoods, north of 805 or north of the Highway 8 or something like that, you could put that down. Likewise, you could list a city, check city, or list a county. Could you list more than one county? Probably. some of you are working in, southern Riverside and southern Orange County as well as northern San Diego. So you could list 3 counties as long as it's not so wide open that there, any property that you could sell would be covered. Likewise, the price range, I've seen this. It's not wise because it could be defeated from 0 to 10 million. Unconscionable. What I've always told agents in the past is, the price range your buyer's in. If a buyer's in $1 million price range, they're not buying a $400,000 house. I can promise you that. They're also, if they only qualify for $1 million, they're not buying a $5 million house. So you could put 500 to 3.5 million. And you're well within the only property they're going to buy anyway. But if you put from $1, I've seen this, $1 to 10 million, that if in the end the buyer decided he didn't want to pay the commission, he'd get it defeated because it's too broad. Okay, you can also list properties. If it's a single property, you could list it, for example, a FSBO, or if there's a group of properties that you could attach a list. All right, compensation here. A is where the compensation is listed. Either A is the boilerplate, either that applies or 2 applies or 3 applies, not 2 and 3 and A. So don't do that because you'll end up being very confusing. So if it's a percentage, then it's a percentage and the dollar amount, add the dollar amount to it. If it's a flat dollar amount, just check A2 and put in the dollar amount. All right. Now, where the and might appear is if you're adding a TC fee. So don't put the word TC fee in there. Put $500. So 3% plus 500. That would get you, the buyer would cover your TC fee for you. Okay. Broker compensation. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, but you're going to discover, wow, does this ever protect agents who work with buyers? This is why you might want to start using a buyer broker agreement, as you're going to see going in. Now, the default on this contract is that it's a non-exclusive representation. In other words, you only get paid if you are involved in the transaction that results, and that results with the buyer getting a house. Now, here's what's interesting. Involvement has a very broad definition, and I would say buyer's agents are going to like this definition because involvement includes, doesn't have to be all of these, it can be any of these. So the first one is the buyer entered and was shown the property by the broker. So if you showed the property to the agent, and then the agent went and bought it without you, but you had a buyer broker agreement, if it wasn't canceled, you'd be entitled to compensation. Wow. If you showed the property virtually, that's number 2, you're entitled to compensation if the buyer ends up acquiring the property. You don't get compensation just showing it virtually. You get it if the buyer completes a transaction and you were involved. See, that's the they define involved. Okay. Number 3, you submitted an offer to the seller. So you actually wrote up an offer and then let's say that, if the seller accepted it, and you went to escrow, then you don't care. I mean, you're not concerned with it. But if the seller rejected it, but then later the buyer went around your back and worked with the seller directly, has that ever happened to anybody on this call? Maybe, right? This, if you had a buyer broker agreement, you would be able to sue and collect a commission. And then finally, if you introduced the buyer to the property, wow. Now, introduced is a judgment call, but they do say if you participated with the buyer in analyzing the property, researching on behalf of the buyer features about the property or the neighborhood, or if you had communications with the seller regarding the buyer's interest in the property. All of that constitutes involvement, and you are entitled to compensation. Compensation is payable if you have broker involvement. Now, broker involvement is not merely sending lists of properties to the buyer. So don't You know, they didn't go that far. So, but they did go pretty broadly. Now, so the default is it's a non-exclusive representation agreement, which the buyer can work with any other broker he wants. And if the other broker helps him get a property, then you don't, you're not necessarily, if you weren't involved in it, you wouldn't get compensated. Exclusive representation, if you check that box, then if the buyer acquires the property, period, during your representation period, or any extension of the representation period, or including the protection period that I'll show you in a few minutes, you would be compensated. So if it's checked, it's a exclusive representation agreement. Cancellation. Now, this agreement can be canceled, and the cancellation, we can get in the weeds a bit. I'm going to try to go through it kind of quickly. We can revisit it again, you know, maybe in a future class. The buyer can cancel a non-exclusive agreement unilaterally, and that cancellation is detailed. Is detailed. A non-exclusive representation would be 4B1, which is the default here on paragraph 4B1. Or if it is a exclusive, the buyer and the listing agent, the buyer's agent, can agree that the buyer can cancel an exclusive buyer representation agreement 30 days after receipt of this notice. All right. Now, if this box here is checked, then the contract cannot be canceled, and it's an exclusive. 4B2 is exclusive. So if this box is checked and you checked 4B2, then you could determine that this is not cancelable. Neither party has a right to cancel unless there's a mutual agreement to cancel. Okay, that's contained in the BC. Now, the cancellation agreement is actually what's a little confusing. The cancellation agreement, you identify the parties and the property, and then it talks about how you can cancel and the effect of cancellation and when you can cancel. All right. So if there is a written agreement and it's non-exclusive, then cancellation is immediate. Or it could be pursuant, or it could be a number of days after receipt of this notice. It can be either one. If it's a exclusive agreement, an exclusive representation agreement, then the cancellation would be effective 30 days after the receipt of this notice. In general, keep this concept in mind. In general, if you have assisted the buyer in any way in identifying some properties, in other words, you've been involved, that list I gave you before, that very broad list of broker involved, the definition of broker involved properties, you're protected. Absent that, and the buyer doesn't want to work with you, this form sort of recognizes why do you want to work with a buyer who doesn't want to work with you? He's not going to go out with you anymore. You're not going to show him any more properties. This does not eliminate your right to be paid on what you help them with. So even if you had an exclusive representation, you still might allow it to be canceled within 30 days after receiving this notice because they don't want you to take them out anymore. You don't want to take them out anymore. You're not working out. You're not working with them anymore. But you still are protected because regardless of this cancellation, you get paid if you meet the definition of a broker involved property. I hope everybody sort of followed along there. All right, let's take a look next. Because in the cancellation, the broker will not be the buyer's agent if there's a cancellation. And then compensation, the compensation to the broker is provided for if, in fact, the property, the broker is entitled to compensation for those properties where there was broker involvement as defined in the BRBC, which was those four things I went through with you, ending with, it's not merely sending a list, but it's just about anything else you do for a buyer, which is a very, very buyer agent friendly provision. All right. Then there's standard, get advice, and then a place to sign. If it's a unilateral, just the buyer can sign it. If it's bilateral, if it's, if it requires mutual consent, in other words, an exclusive agreement requires mutual consent. If it's exclusive, then the buyer and the broker must sign. Any question on the cancellation? I think I scared you a little bit. I don't know. All right. Now let's go back. Let's see. Continuing on the cancellation agreement, the COBR. I'm sorry, we're not quite done with it. The compensation is detailed, and I know how you're compensated. I sort of referenced it already. You get compensated if you are involved, property for which there was broker involvement, and it's those same four things. You showed the property, you showed it virtually, you submitted a signed offer to the seller, or you introduced the buyer, and introducing the buyer is defined as analyzing, researching, talking with the seller about the property. It does not include sending a list. Merely sending a list of properties with no other documented action by the broker would not satisfy this number 4 requirement. All right. Now, if there's a cancellation, you could just cancel it by getting your expenses paid. So you could check that box if you wanted. You could cancel it. Maybe the buyer wants to work with another agent. Sometimes that happens. And then the new agent says, look, I'll pay your old agent a referral fee. And you might agree to, let this wrap this up. I'll accept a referral fee. So you cancel the buyer broker agreement, the buyer representation agreement, by accepting a referral fee. And then there would be a separate referral fee agreement. Or the broker might receive compensation from the seller. It could also be a cancellation with no compensation, you're walking away clean. So there are other ways to detail how you get compensated in the event of a cancellation. And of course, there's a place for the buyer and the signature of the buyers and the brokers. Okay, now back to the buyer representation agreement. So accounting for the payments to the broker. If anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for service with this agreement, that amount shall be credited toward the buyer's obligation to pay this compensation. And we went through the calculation on how that occurs a little earlier. So again, you should understand, and your buyers should understand, and your sellers should understand, and especially buyers, probably sellers don't care. They're only going to pay what they pay. But a buyer is not going to get, a buyer's agent is not going to get paid twice. You don't get paid twice. So this protects a buyer from paying under the buyer broker agreement when in fact the buyer's agent is being paid by the seller because of the MLS. So that documents that. Okay. Now, if the third party payment exceeds the amount of the buyer's obligation, what do you do with the excess amount? Now, the default is you get it. So notice there's no box to check, or you could credit it to the buyer. In the past, I've had agents tell me that they got buyer broker agreements signed by always referencing this paragraph and dialogue, something to the effect, look, if I'm getting paid more than what you and I agreed, I want to have a written agreement that I don't benefit from that. I don't want you to think I'm going to show you a house because I'm getting a bonus. So any bonus I get above and beyond what you've agreed to pay me, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer, I want you to have it. And so we're going to check this box right here, credit the buyer, but I need you to sign this form. And they end up, getting a buyer broker agreement signed by virtue of discussing this very paragraph. Because a very similar paragraph exists in the current agreement. Okay, I hit something here. Now, where am I at here? Oh, yeah. All right. Now, authorization to include commission in the offer, that you check this box if in fact you have a buyer broker agreement and you're going to go back and check that box in 3M3. Remember that was or 3G3, I'm sorry, 3G3. That was the very first slide I showed you. So the buyer is authorizing you to check that box and getting compensation paid by the seller. And so because that compensation that the seller pays, if your buyer broker agreement is greater than what the MLS says, by checking that box in 3G3, the seller's agreeing to pay the total amount, less, pay the difference in addition to what is in the MLS. So that's why you want to check this if, in fact, you are going to ask the seller to pay. If you don't ask the seller to pay, the buyer still won't pay anything that is already paid by the listing agreement. I mean, the MLS agreement by virtue of 4D1. All right. So let's get my thought here where we're at exactly. So I think now we need to look at, additional broker right to compensation. Brokers entitled to compensation provided in 4A within blank calendar after expiration of the representation period if there's a cancellation. So if they do cancel, you're allowed to be compensated for those broker involved transactions that this buyer ends up completing where you had involvement in them. Okay. Now, you can also provide a notice to the buyer upon cancellation of your broker involved properties. And so that's a notice of broker involved properties. This is the way you would list the properties that you are involved in. It's very straightforward. In the interest of time, I won't, just go through this line by line by line. It basically states that you have a right to compensation to the following properties, and you can list those properties here, or you can attach, if the list is longer, you can attach additional properties. So that's very similar to a form we have now, where it's when you have a buyer broker agreement, the broker is reserving these properties. If you buy them, I get paid. So you can use this form and list those properties there. And then there's a place for everybody to sign. All right, back to the BRBC. Disclosure of anticipated payments to the broker by others. You are obligated to disclose any commission you are anticipating receiving, any payment you're anticipating receiving by virtue of selling this house. That is going to be a requirement going forward. And there's a form for that, the ABCD. The ABCD is a form where you list the compensation on the properties you're showing the buyer. Now, you can do it simply by attaching a copy of the MLS, providing the buyer a copy of the MLS, because going forward, the MLS is the buyer is going to be able to see the compensation to the buyer's agent contained in the MLS. The CBB or the BACOM is now going to be a public field. So rather than listing all of these properties in the next screen, well, let me finish this thing. Rather than listing all these properties, you can simply do it by providing copies of the MLS. So the form, you put your agent's name on the top of the form, and the agent's signature signs the form. The buyer's name goes on this form. So the buyer's broker is your name, and then you sign this. And you are you're documenting that you are providing the buyer a copy of how much compensation you'd receive, because that's going to be a requirement going forward. Buyers are to be told how much commission you are going to get if, not when, if you sell that house. Because imagine you present a house where you're getting a 10% commission. Well, that's ludicrous. I know you probably won't. But what about a 4% commission? And the buyer is having a hard time coming up with a price that the seller will accept. It's pretty obvious that part of that problem is they're paying a pretty high commission. And so DOJ has convinced NAR that buyers have a right to know that. They have a right to know how much you're getting paid because that does affect the sale price. So you're going to have to document that you have, in fact, provided this anticipated broker compensation disclosure. So it's going to be a pretty important form going forward. And again, you can simplify it by simply providing the MLS to the buyer of any property you write, because the MLS will, repeating myself, have that commission on it. Or you can list, the properties and what the compensation was, and was it from the MLS? It was from a CBC or other. So I suspect that, you probably won't be doing this too much. You'll be just giving copies of the MLS. And then you must disclose to the buyer in the end what you finally received. So that is what this you'll complete this form upon, this section gets completed after the escrow closes. So you give the top half of the form straight away, but you retain the original, and then you complete the bottom half of the form after the close of escrow. This is going to be a requirement going forward. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? Everybody's scared to talk. Nobody wants to run the class long. Okay. Back to the BC. Okay. Timing of compensation. You get compensation upon the close of the transaction, or if the transaction was prevented by default of the buyer upon the buyer's default. And if the transaction was prevented by the default of any other party and the buyer collects damages, then you get 1/2 of the damages they recovered, but not to exceed the amount you were entitled to. So this is very similar to other buyer broker agreements and for that matter, listing contracts as well. Okay, payment through escrow. The buyer broker agreement is paid through escrow. Like I said before, it's part of the closing costs. And the buyer, if there's a pre-existing agreement for compensation, then the broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent the buyer in such a transaction. Agency disclosure, pretty straightforward. Authorizations and obligations, that's a fairly straightforward thing. They're authorizing you to locate a property and obtain reports and investigate, do all the things that you normally do if you're a conscientious buyer's agent. The buyer is authorizing you to do that. Again, recognize this is a buyer, a buyer agent employment agreement with the buyer. So these are the things that you're being authorized to do on behalf of the buyer. And so you're also going to do an AVID, of course, that the law requires it. You'll communicate to the buyer all the disclosures, and you'll perform all services in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. Fairly boilerplate. Okay, there's also a buyer transactional advisory. In the interest of time, I won't go through that in great detail. It's very straightforward. It just gives the buyer information about what they should be advised when they're entering into a transaction to buy a property. Now, it references a BMI that buyers need to notify their agent in writing of any material important issues. So this form is very good. It's very similar to a buyer advisory, investigation advisory, and it references the BMI. And of course, we talked about the BMI before. If the BMI is where the buyer tells you what is of concern to them early in the transaction. This is done ideally immediately. The offer is accepted. What material issues are you concerned about in going forward with this house? We've talked about it before. What this BMI prevents is a buyer after the fact ending up with a property now they're not too happy with, and maybe they claim, often falsely, that their agent knew they didn't want to buy a property like this, but they ended up buying one anyway. And so I've got all kinds of examples the funniest story, I think, not funny to me, I wasn't too funny for the agent involved, but it was just ludicrous. The buyer did not want to have any property associated with anybody who smoked anywhere near the property. And of course, she ended up buying a condo where the next door neighbor was a chain smoker. And then the buyer wanted to sue everybody, including us, because she told everybody from the get-go she couldn't be near smoke. Or she never did, of course. But had she done a BMI correctly from her perspective, she would have said, I need to avoid properties where smoking is present. What she put on her BMI was something about the carpet was kind of old. I wish we got a credit. And so this BMI saved us from getting sued. Well, actually, the poor agent did end up getting sued in small claim court, but we won even in small claims court, partially because of the BMI. So the BMI is a very important form. We require it. And if you do a BMI, you also want to do a buyer's satisfaction investigation, which means that they did a BMI. And on the BMI, they had something other than none. Now, if they do none, you don't need a buyer satisfaction of investigation. But if they put anything in the BMI, then we want to document that they've satisfied themselves that that's no longer a concern to them, because we don't want it to close escrow. They told us they don't want to buy any property with asbestos, and there was not another word said about asbestos. They closed escrow, and then they discover they got asbestos. We're going to have a problem. So they tell us they don't want to buy a property with asbestos. We tell them that, okay, an asbestos investigation will cost you $500. They don't want to spend it. They're okay, never mind. Well, satisfaction of investigation form is signed saying, whatever we put on the BMI, we're okay with it. Or maybe they got an asbestos inspection and they were okay with the results. So if the BMI has anything other than none, then be sure you do the buyer satisfaction of investigation. All right. So, and again, the BTA, the buyer transactional advisory, just has more additional generic information that you're pretty familiar with. Buyer authorization obligations, we talked about that. Now the buyer, if the property contains 1 to 4 residential units, the buyer will conduct an AVID, and then we talked about that. We'll communicate all our disclosures, and we'll perform all of our services. I think I already went straight down that already on a previous slide. Other obligations, pretty straightforward, good faith, reasonable care and professional assistance. Buyer will agree to pay for any reports they want. They will do a BMI, and they are responsible if they give us incomplete or inaccurate information for their own damages, not us. And then dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration, only if an arbitration form is also signed. This form does not, the BRBC, the Buyer Representation Agreement, does not have an automatic arbitration provision that can be initialed. It does have mediation. Mediation's automatic, but if the buyer and the buyer's agent want to agree to arbitration, you have to include the CAR form ARB. And any other additional forms that are attached, a transactional advisory will print with the BRBC, the Buyer Representation Agreement, and also the BIA will print, and so will the PRBS. Those will print automatically with the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. And then finally, there's a place for, if it's an entity buyer, it's very similar to the RPA or listing contract, and then signatures for both the buyer and the broker. And that completes the class. Whew! How many people are totally confused?
It's
Well,
okay.
there are some questions in the chat, but I'm going to
Let's-
go ahead and write them down for you, and we can contact those agents independently, just because there's another training at noon for the Zoom. So
Okay, and maybe what I'll do is I'll answer the questions maybe in a public forum, maybe in Agent Hub, and then
Yeah.
we'll disseminate it to the agents
Yeah.
company-wide.
I can do
You know,
that.
Walt, I think that's a great idea. We should do like an FAQ of some sort, right? So some questions and it's like frequently asked questions with these kind of pertaining with these, you know, some of these subjects and maybe have some short answers for them because we covered a lot today. And you know what? Some agents are probably freaked out. Some are actually, you know, pretty happy about this. And I'm kind of feeling a little indifferent at this point because obviously change, there comes opportunity with it. So I see some of the opportunities that come with this. I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, I think once we get used to it, folks, if you're intimidated by this at all, in the future, very near future, we're going to schedule classes on how you present buyer broker agreements to your buyers and how you know, explain it, because in the future, you're going to be wanting probably more and more to have this protection. And like I said in this class, it's a very buyer agent friendly document. It really does help you a lot. And it doesn't necessarily disadvantage the buyer in any way. They're not paying extra to hire you. Yeah, we will do additional classes and we'll do a public Q&A. I'll respond to that.
Awesome. Thank you.
That was an intense one, Walt. Good job.
Okay.
I'm
Thanks,
glad,
Walt.
I'm glad this is recorded. We get to listen to it about 5 times.
I'm afraid to listen to it. I'll probably cringe as I listen to it. I hope it went well.
That was great. A lot of
Okay.
information. Holy mackerel.
Lots of info for sure. Yeah, but we'll do part 2 to this because there's definitely more information I'm sure you got to cover, Walt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we got more to talk about. And we'll do another one in the next. You'll get notice on that. Thank you, everybody, for joining
Thank you,
me.
Walt.
And
Thank you,
Walt.
Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Walt. I'll never understand how you decipher all this stuff for us. We can't do it without you.
Better him than us.
Yeah, no
exactly right.
kidding.
Well said, Lindsay.
I like
All right.
doing it. You're all great. Thank you.
We'll talk soon.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
You are.